So the Bible and politics, and the prophecy of Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah records the ministry of a prophet who lived through some of the most traumatic events in Israel's history. He was called to deliver God's words of judgment and hope during the turbulent years that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and the subsequent exile of the Jewish people to Babylon. And the book, as Stephen mentioned, is often regarded as having a very political theme. For, as we'll see, Jeremiah was directly challenging the political rulers and societal behaviors of the time, delivering a powerful countercultural message to people who had got their relationship with God and understanding of his sovereignty completely wrong. It's the longest book in the Bible, and it does require a little bit of a history lesson. So, Jeremiah was born to a priestly family in a town just outside of Jerusalem. So he grew up in the area around Jerusalem, knew it well, probably around 650 BC. And some 20 or so years later, he received his call from God to be a prophet. And this was in the 13th year of the reign of King Josiah, who was actually, interestingly, only 8 years old when he inherited the throne from his father Ammon and grandfather Manasseh, both of whom had led the people further and further away from God. Now, by the time Josiah began prophesying, there was this great hope in the land, brought about by the reforms of Josiah. He had set his heart on following God, unlike his father and grandfather. And yet this was set against the backdrop of a growing threat from the rising power of the Babylonians. The book of Jeremiah begins with God calling him to be a prophet and giving him this dual vocation. He was to be a prophet to Israel and the nations, and his words would uproot and tear down, but also plant and build up. Jeremiah was to accuse the Israelites and warn them of God's coming judgment, but he was to also give a message of hope for the future. And that introduction perfectly kind of summarizes the opening block, kind of the first 24 chapters of Jeremiah, which is basically a collection of Jeremiah's writings and prophecies from before the time of exile. The major power in the region at the start of his prophesying was the Assyrian Empire, which was then in its kind of last days under its ruler, Ashurbanipal. Now, Ashurbanipal was able to retain power and maintain the boundaries of his empire right up into his death in about 627 BC. But by then, his empire began to fragment, and it was the Medes, and particularly the Babylonians, who began to seize the territory formerly belonging to the Assyrians. And against the backdrop of that kind of turmoil taking place outside the kingdom of Judah, it meant that it had left King Josiah free to pursue his own path in Judah. And he set about removing all the old shrines to pagan gods, restoring the temples and priestly orders, and renewing the covenant with God. Jeremiah sought to bring this covenant message of God's salvation and promise of deliverance back to the center of the people's lives. And yet, even during this period, even during Josiah's days, Jeremiah still delivered a message that was out of step with popular sentiment. The core message of the first section of the book of Jeremiah is how Israel had broken its covenant with God and violated all the terms of the agreement in a number of ways. The people adopted the worship of all types of Canaanite gods and built idol shrines all over the land. Jeremiah uses a metaphor of idolatry as adultery, and he uses the language of prostitution and promiscuity and unfaithfulness to describe how the people had given their allegiance to other gods. Jeremiah also repeatedly accuses Judah's corrupt leaders, their priests, kings and prophets have all abandoned the law and the covenant, leading to this tragic consequence of rampant social injustice. The most vulnerable people in the communities, the widows, the orphans and immigrants were being taken advantage of in clear violation of the law. And Israel's leaders seemingly didn't care. Now, as a result of this unwelcome message that Jeremiah was delivering, there were plots against his life. The community greeted him with a broad ostracism. And this just really highlights the difficulty that the reform movement under Josiah faced in Judah, even with royal support. The people may have thought that, we're doing fine, and God was blessing them. But the reality was completely different. And that was a difficult message for them to hear and accept. A classic place where all of these themes come together is in chapter 7. And it's often called Jeremiah's Temple Sermon. The setting is the people of Judah coming to worship their God in the temple in Jerusalem, acting as if everything in their life is fine. Outside the temple, however, they are worshipping other gods, even adopting this horrifying practice of child sacrifice. So Jeremiah makes a really unpopular announcement. The God of Israel is coming in judgment to destroy his own temple in Jerusalem, the holy city, and punish the people by sending an enemy from the north. This is an army that God would allow to conquer Jerusalem, the great empire of Babylon. Judah's independence clearly did not last long. The Egyptians ultimately came to the aid of the Assyrians, and Josiah was killed in battle at Megiddo. And so the Egyptians controlled Judah for the next few years and eventually made Jehoiakim king of Judah, who promptly suspended and reversed all of Josiah's great reforms. And all of this leads up to this crucial turning point in chapter 25, which we had read to us. Judah has still not turned back to its God. So in the first year of Babylon's new king, of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, God tells Jeremiah to announce that the armies of Babylon were coming to conquer and take the people into exile for 70 years. He compares Babylon to a cup of wine filled with God's wrath and anger at all of Israel's injustice and idolatry. And he says that he will make Israel and the surrounding nations drink from that cup. And this chapter is key to the design of the book of Jeremiah, as everything that follows then focuses on Babylon's coming attacks, first on Israel and Judah, and then on the other nations. The Egyptians were ultimately defeated by King Nebuchadnezzar, and from then on, the people of Judah had to pay tributes to Babylon instead of Egypt. Now, King Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon, only to be defeated. After he had died, he was replaced by his son, who adopted a similar anti-Babylonian stance. And he too was eventually deposed by the Babylonians and replaced by his uncle Zedekiah. He too attempted to rebel against the Babylonians. You can see this common thread in history happening, a period of great turmoil. And this led to the Babylonians laying siege to Jerusalem. And eventually, Zedekiah too is captured and meets a gruesome end. His eyes are put out by the Babylonians, but not before he has to witness his family being slaughtered in front of him. And all of this turmoil gives the impression that God really had abandoned the people of Judah. And yet this is actually the opposite of what was happening. And everything that happened was according to God's plan, just as he had prophesied through Jeremiah. Back in chapter 2, Jeremiah began by chiding the people for sins that revolved around idolatry. But embedded in that passage and continuing through to the end of that chapter are allusions to another sin, this one on a more political plane. He says, now why go to Egypt to drink from the Nile? And why go to Assyria to drink water from the Euphrates? Why do you go about so much changing your ways? You will be disappointed by Egypt as you were by Assyria. What's happening here? Well, the people of Judah were looking to join forces with Egypt to fully see off the fading Assyrians. But God sees this as an act of rebellion and of discarding everything he had done in the past for his people. Remember, God had brought the people out of slavery in Egypt. And here they were, attempting to join forces with the Egyptians. And because of the people's continued rebellious and sinful nature, God then designated Babylon to be the dominant power of the age. Jeremiah characterizes this in chapter 25 as a divine punishment for Judah's sins. They have no choice but to submit. And then should they refuse, they do so at their own peril. He says, "Now I will give all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. All nations will serve him and his son and grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. If, however, any nation or kingdom will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, or bow its neck under his yoke, I will punish that nation with the sword, famine, and plague, declares the Lord, until I destroy it by his hand." That really is quite an unexpected thing to hear. And yet Jeremiah had been warning the people about God's judgment for 23 years. And so God decreed that the people of Judah would endure 70 years of captivity under the Babylonians. What does all of that have to tell us about the Bible and politics? Well, crucially, it tells us that God is the master of history and has the prerogative to award power to whoever he chooses to prosper. Relying upon Assyria or Egypt rather than Babylon, therefore, constitutes, according to Jeremiah, not simply an inadvisable political choice, but an outright denial of the divine hand to history. Jeremiah was called to one of the most difficult ministries of any man in the Bible. He was called to speak God's message of judgment as the nation of Judah approached conquest and dissolution. He was viewed as this demoralizing naysayer, a doom and gloom prophet. He was at times physically accosted, slandered, imprisoned, put on trial for his life. He was always ignored. His every prophetic utterance was contradicted by priests and a group of false prophets who promised better days would come soon. And at one point, the king of Judah personally destroyed a book of prophecies that Jeremiah had been writing, requiring its complete rewriting. In the time of Zedekiah's reign, the Babylonian armies had twice laid siege to Jerusalem and received its surrender. And yet they spared the city from destruction. Such was God's will. Now, once again, having not learned his lesson, Zedekiah was entertaining thoughts of rebellion, and he gathered diplomats from Judah's former long-term enemies that they might be possible allies now. And they all came to the royal court in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah appeared before these political leaders and told them in no uncertain terms they were not to rebel against Babylon, or they would bring bloodshed upon themselves. Now, the people of Judah wanted a feel-good message from God, so the priests and the prophets were assuring them that everything was going to be fine. Jeremiah had been preaching to them for years with no response. Finally, he gave his message to the assembled ambassadors, and he was very specific about the harm that would come to their nations if they resisted Babylon. He was very clear in warning them against the lies of false prophets. Jeremiah began with the assumption that all governments and nations were under the control of God. The basis of God's sovereignty, he noted, was that he is the creator of all things. And remember, this was a message given not just to the people of Judah, but outsiders from foreign nations who had all come together. God is not only the God of his covenant people, but of heaven and earth and all people in it. Nobody is outside the realm of his authority and command. And Jeremiah's second point was that King Nebuchadnezzar was given his position by God, who raises and overthrows nations at will. By grace, God was revealing his decree regarding Babylon's ascendancy so that those nations had the opportunity to avoid the fatal mistake of resisting God's will. Jeremiah's words were a gracious warning. Don't stand opposed to God's work in history. The false prophets, however, had decided for themselves what they thought God should do, and they constructed their own message around that vision. They were the ones who really held the power behind the throne of Judah's monarchy and priesthood and people. And yet, their unity could never stand against God's providence. God cast them aside, drove the people from their land into exile, until he would eventually raise up a remnant of them through which he would work his salvation plan. Chapter 29 of Jeremiah is seen as a letter which Jeremiah felt the need to write to the exiles in Babylon at that time, all because of a certain false prophet who was misleading the people. The false prophet was claiming that the exile would be over in a couple of years and that the people should only plan to stay in the land of Babylon for a short time. But God had revealed to Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years and that the people should prepare to be in the land of Babylon for several generations. God was responsible for this situation. God used Nebuchadnezzar to bring about the just consequence of exile on his faithless people. And God also had a plan for how his people should conduct themselves while they were in Babylon. He wanted his people to focus on public and private good. They were to grow their families and work for the city's welfare in exile, in Babylon. And yet that isn't actually the political message at the heart of Jeremiah. Now, the reason this narrative was and remains shocking is because the people assumed quite a lot based on their status and identity as God's covenant people. They believed they were his own unique possession among all the nations of the world. They had assumed first that God wouldn't let something like exile happen to them. It had. They then assumed that God's will was for them to resist Babylon's rule. It wasn't. They had assumed that it would be a relatively short time before God re-established Judah as an independent kingdom and returned the exiles to Jerusalem. It wouldn't be. At every turn, they had precisely the wrong expectations. And this is why Jeremiah's message was so hard to hear and why he faced so much opposition, as we heard in our second reading. Perhaps even more shocking and offensive to the Israelites was what Jeremiah says next in chapter 29. He tells the people to pray for the peace of Babylon, because their welfare, the welfare of Babylon, would determine Judah's welfare. Imagine God's will is for you to pray for your enemy. This feels like the kind of crazy stuff we were to hear centuries later when a certain carpenter from Nazareth was teaching to all who would listen. Jeremiah further tells the exiled Judeans not to listen to these false prophets and diviners who were encouraging this false presuppositions and faithless activity. These false prophets were telling the people what they wanted to hear, such as, because we are God's covenant people, God is with us against Babylon. This exile will be short in duration. He wants us to resist. He will prosper our resistance. But that wasn't the case. And then we come to probably the most well-known and taken out of context verse in the book of Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah assures the Israelites that God has a purpose for this beyond mere punishment. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I know the plans I have for you. It is I who know the plans. The significance of that emphasis is to highlight the contrast between God's own knowledge of his plans and the supposed knowledge of the false prophets. I, not they, know the plans I have for you. If you do insist on taking Jeremiah 29:11 as a feel-good motto for yourself, at least be prepared to endure 70 years of suffering. God's plans are good plans, but they are not only good simply because they are plans for peace and prosperity. And these false prophets have been saying that God was going to give Judah peace and prosperity. They are plans for a future and a hope, even in the midst of exile in a foreign land. But this is only a part of what is good about them. More importantly, God's plans are for a repaired relationship with his people. You will call on me and come, and you will pray to me, and I will listen to you. Neither part of that had been happening so long as Israel and Judah continued living in rebellion against God. And that relationship could not be repaired as long as the people continued to listen to false prophets. The good promise of God was if they would just remain faithful, demonstrating their faithfulness by accepting their situation as intended by God and not follow the advice of false prophets to resist their situation in a variety of ways, then they would see good days once again. First in Babylon itself, and later on, after 70 years, back in Israel. It's here where I sometimes find that the book of Jeremiah feels more applicable to the world of sports. As a Manchester United fan, I feel the pain of a long, drawn-out, painful period, thinking it's going to be short, but no. I just hope and pray it's not 70 years before we next win the league title. As I was researching this talk, I read an interesting piece by an evangelical leader in America. And he was writing a sermon in the wake of Donald Trump's electoral defeat to Joe Biden back in 2020. And he said, for a long time, Christians in the US, but I think we could expand this actually to the whole of the Western Hemisphere, Christians have been in a position of some illusory power and political and social power. We believe our ethics and values have frequently shaped culture and public policy. Whether or not this narrative is actually true, the problem with this narrative is that when we accept it and live in it, we stop feeling a pressing need for God to defend us because we feel we can defend ourselves. We confuse our illusory power with God's blessing, and we rely on it as if we were God's protection. Things are going well for us, we're being blessed by God. We don't need to worry about what's actually happening. It's a false narrative. Because when things change, when the politicians who are elected to govern us or are seen to influence public opinion and political will, when they are at odds with our own beliefs, we can start to feel threatened and feel we no longer hold this previously assumed place of privilege in society. And that can frighten us. But we don't need to be frightened. Our status as seemingly cultural outsiders or spiritual foreigners, as immigrants lacking political power, isn't something necessarily contrary to the will of God. God designs things this way for his own glory. Like the people of Judah living in Babylon, we need to have the faith to accept that this can be the reality to which God himself has called us, no matter who the political leaders may be. We are chosen by God to be his faithful people, and it is not for us to assume that we know God's will. To resist this identity is to resist the will of God. and to resist the good plan of God for our benefit and not for our harm. Now, of course, this can present us with the challenge of how do we balance what we see as politics that needs to be challenged, as Jeremiah did, with what is the will of God. And that's something that's challenged the conservative and liberal Christians in America for quite some time, with their opposing, often, political views. But perhaps no more so than in recent times in the past few years. Imagine, was it God's will using evil Donald Trump to bring about the good and godly presidency of Joe Biden? Or, in fact, did God use evil Joe to bring about the anointed godly presidency of Donald Trump? I imagine the answer to that depends on who you're asking in America. But the problem with claiming God's message for political means is that it's usually not God's message. Something these false prophets were doing then and still do to this day. George W. Bush famously claimed that God told him to invade Iraq. Now, of course, I don't know if God actually really did. I would suspect that the nearly 300,000 people who subsequently died from the resulting violence of the US invasion might challenge that notion. And the problem with saying God told me to do this, or this is the will of the God, is that it can become a means to justify or excuse political and personal agendas, not the will of God. The excusing and justifying of illegal invasions, the excusing and justifying of illegal annexations, the excusing and justifying of persecution of minorities, the excusing and justifying of the killing of those opposed to your political views. Ultimately, it is not for us to be able to predict the will of God, but it is for us to see when things are happening in our society that are clearly contrary to the message of the gospel. When we see exclusion, hatred, division, when we see the poor and vulnerable being exploited and oppressed by the rich and powerful, it's then that we must stick as close as ever to the message of the gospel, to love God and to love all people, seeking to be a righteous people worthy of God's salvation. Prophecy is inherently political. Its purpose is to engender change in society, something that is just as relevant today as it was centuries ago. Prophets of God arise when the status quo is corrupt and needs to be shaken up. And in challenging those hierarchies and things, it can feel sometimes like the whole world is against you, that you are speaking out of step with popular opinion. But we are called to stand up and challenge when we can see that God's rule is not being obeyed. Jesus told his followers to be salt and light, to let the light of God shine through you, to give seasoning to the world so that the world can see and taste God's love and mercy and goodness. That's why we don't shy away from politics. Why we don't hide our faith away, limiting it to a Sunday morning in church. Because we are blessed when we make a difference and allow God's plan to unfold in our lives.